Albert Einstein once famously said, "If you want your children to be intelligent, read them fairy tales. And if you want them to be more intelligent, read them more fairy tales." Hi, I'm Sarah Baldwin. This is another Sunday with Sarah. And you guessed it, the topic of today's episode is fairy tales. Why and how they're used in Waldorf education, and how you can bring fairy tales into your life at home with children. So why fairy tales? Well, fairy tales are stories that have been collected over thousands of years, passed down orally from generation to generation. And they are filled with symbolism and archetypes and spiritual truths that speak to a child and all of us at a very deep level. And for the young child under the age of 7, we're trying to teach them that the world is a good place that they've come into, that the world is a righteous and just place. And fairy tales feed that need for a young child, because in a fairy tale, good always overcomes evil. And a child finds that very satisfying. Now, if you, in Waldorf education, we tell stories by heart. We say a teacher will often memorize the story and just be able to tell it eye to eye, heart to heart to the child, which is a wonderful experience. I urge you to try it. It's challenging, and memorizing those stories for yourself is a rich experience. Repetition. We will tell the same story every day for a week or 2 weeks. Children will often ask to hear it again and again, and you might get bored as an adult repeating the same story, but it's really satisfying for a child. That allows them to take the story in at a very deep level until it becomes a part of them. They will remember that story for the rest of their life and tell their own children someday those stories. And one recommendation to you is to think back to your own childhood. Think of the fairy tales that you loved, that you still remember, and start with those. Because the chances are, if a story resonated deeply with you as a child, your enthusiasm for that story will transfer to your child, and your child will love it as well. So parents often wonder and raise the question, well, fairy tales are dark, they're scary, they're sexist. One thing it's important to understand is those fairy tales are full of archetypes. You've got, the witch, or an evil stepmother, or a wise king, or the heroine, or the hero. And what's important to realize is that all of those elements, all of those archetypes are part of ourselves, part of the human being. And a child will relate to each of those characters. As adults, we want all those different elements of ourselves to be integrated. So I believe that, and the other thing is, in telling a story, we don't over-dramatize the story. Because yes, some of them are scary, and I'll talk in a little bit about age-appropriate stories for different ages. You don't want to read Hansel and Gretel, say, to a 3-year-old, but an older child can handle that. But if we tell the story in a very gentle, even-toned way, without a lot of over-dramatization, a child will just picture it in his or her head, just as scary as he or she can handle. If we over-dramatize with a big ogre's voice or a wicked witch, that can be scary for a child. But by just telling the story very matter-of-factly, the child gets those deeper meanings and finds it deeply satisfying without being frightening. So I believe every home should have a collection of the complete Grimm's fairy tales. These were stories that were collected by the brothers Grimms and put into word and published. And if you don't already have a copy, I recommend the Pantheon edition. This translation is one favored by many Waldorf teachers, and it's the translation I used as a kindergarten for many years. But there are also folk tales from around the world, and not just European folk tales. There are Asian folk tales and Indian folk tales. There's a collection of stories, I don't know if it's still in print, called Best Loved Folk Tales from Around the World, that have folk tales from Scandinavia and the UK. So get familiar with some of them. I will tell you that I have not read every story in Grimm's collection of fairy tales, but as I was preparing for this video and gathering my thoughts, I just made it a goal for myself to read through this whole collection. Another suggestion I was going to make is to read fairy tales to yourself as an adult before going to bed. And sometimes we read the story and take it into our sleep. We gain new insight into the story. So that's something you could try. So as I mentioned, there are age-appropriate stories that meet the child that are more developmentally appropriate. So for young 3- and 4-year-olds, one of the simplest Grimm's stories is called Sweet Porridge. I used that when I taught a nursery class of 3- and 4-year-olds and did it as a puppet play. Goldilocks and the Three Bears is a great one for the younger child. The Russian folktale, the Turnip, where a big giant turnip has grown in the ground and the grandfather can't pull it out, so he enlists the help of the grandmother, and together they pull and pull, and they still can't pull it out, and then they get to the grandchild, and then the dog, and then the cat, and finally with the help of a little mouse, working all together, they pull the turnip out of the ground. For 4- and 5-year-olds, the Three Billy Goats Gruff is a great one. The Three Little Pigs, and from Grimm's The Shoemaker and the Elves, one of my favorites. And then when the child gets to be 5 going on 6, this is when you can get into some of the meatier fairy tales that we think of. The Frog Prince, which is actually the very first one. It's called The Frog King in the original Grimm's. It's the first fairy tale in the collection. Little Red Cap, which we know as Little Red Riding Hood. And you'll be surprised sometime if you're not familiar with the original Grimm's and only the Disney versions, just how different they are. I'll do another video later on those differences. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. By 6 years old, they love Hansel and Gretel, and one of my favorites is Snow White and Rose Red. And by first grade in a Waldorf school, fairy tales are a big part of the first grade curriculum, and that's when you can get into stories like Cinderella and Rapunzel, which if you read the original versions are quite dark but very satisfying for children. So there's so much more I could say on this subject. I will say more on this subject in future videos. As always, subscribe to our YouTube channel, Sunday with Sarah YouTube channel, if you have any questions or comments for me, and I imagine this topic will bring up a lot of questions. You can send them to sundaywithsarah@bellalunatoys.com, and I may answer them on a future video. So thanks so much for watching. See you again next time. Bye.